Eleanor had always been known in the neighborhood as the widow, actually. She had lived alone in her modest house for as long as the locals could remember. At 60, her body had lost the youthful grace of her younger days, though. Her movements remained deliberate and sure, as if each step was part of an ongoing rhythm she'd been following for decades. Her hair, streaked with silver, hung loosely around her shoulders, often swept back into a simple bun or left to cascade over her aging face. A lifetime of memories seemed to be carried in every wrinkle and every gesture. Eleanor was a woman whose face had told stories, most of them sorrowful, and her eyes gray and tired held more history than any person should bear. She had lived through too many goodbyes, too many silent meals, and too many evenings where the absence of her son, Matthew, was felt most strongly in the empty chair beside her. The neighbors often referred to her as Widow Eleanor, though not out of malice, but out of habit. It had become a label, a simple fact of her existence. Matthew, her son, had been taken from her 10 years ago. A tragic accident. She had been a mother with dreams of seeing her son grow, and a wife with hopes of a long life with Thomas, her husband. But in one swift, painful moment, all of that was stolen from her. Her son had died, and her life had been irrevocably changed. Eleanor hadn't realized how much of herself she had poured into her son until he was no longer there. And after Thomas passed away, it became even more evident how much emptiness had taken root in her heart. The house was quiet. It was always quiet. During the day, Eleanor kept herself busy tending to the garden, something she had always loved. The act of watering plants, trimming the hedges, and planting new flowers had become a ritual, a way to keep herself occupied, a way to make the house feel alive again. Every morning she would put on her gardening gloves and carry her old, worn metal watering can to the backyard. It was her only way to feel connected to the world outside her grief-stricken thoughts. It was her way of making sure something in her life still grew. Eleanor would often walk the garden in silence, glancing over the rows of flowers, the lavender, the rosemary, the chrysanthemums, all planted and nurtured with care. But no matter how much she tried to occupy her mind, her gaze would always find its way back to one spot, the window to room 5. The door had been locked for as long as she could remember, ever since Matthew's tragic death. The room had once belonged to her son, a place where his toys and books had lived, where his laughter had echoed through the house. But after the accident, she couldn't bear the thought of anyone living in that room, not even herself. For years, that door remained locked, untouched, a silent memorial to the boy who would never come back. And every time Eleanor passed it, she felt a pang in her heart, a mixture of sorrow, longing, and guilt. If she stood there long enough, she could almost hear Matthew's voice calling out to her. But no one ever came. Life, as she knew it, had become a cycle, one day after the other, each indistinguishable from the last. And it wasn't until the arrival of Julian that things began to shift in ways she never anticipated. Julian moved in next door one Saturday morning. His car was parked in front of the house, next to the picket fence that separated their properties. He was a thin, young man, a few years younger than Matthew would have been had he survived. His curly brown hair was messy, as though he had just rolled out of bed, and his bright eyes had the unmistakable glint of someone just starting out in life. Julian carried a heavy backpack, his shoulders hunched as if weighed down not just by his belongings, but by an invisible burden. He seemed like the type of person who could either be cheerful or distant, depending on the day. Eleanor first saw him as he was moving his things into the house, hauling boxes across the yard to the small, quiet cottage that stood next door. His back bent under the weight of a large bag, his clothes slightly askew as he adjusted himself to the newness of the neighborhood. He waved at Linda, her cousin, who had lived next door for as long as Eleanor could remember. The sound of their Brief conversation drifted across the yard, but Eleanor didn't pay it much attention. She had no reason to. He was just another neighbor, someone who would come and go, someone who would occupy the space for a while before disappearing like everyone else in her life. But then, a few days later, Julian knocked on Eleanor's door. He was holding a book in his hand and looked sheepish as he greeted her. "I'm sorry to bother you," he said, his voice quiet, almost apologetic. "I just moved in and I don't have anything to read. Would it be all right if I borrowed a book?" Eleanor studied him for a moment. He wasn't aggressive or forceful. There was an uncertainty in his eyes, a tenderness that reminded her of a younger version of herself. She nodded without thinking, stepping aside to let him in. Her hands were still covered in dirt from the garden, but she didn't mind. There was something comforting about the silence between them as she walked him into the living room. She didn't say much. It wasn't necessary. She simply went to her bookshelf, pulled out a well-worn Steinbeck novel, and handed it to him. "This one's a bit sad," she said, her voice low and soft. "But it's real. And good." Julian smiled, the kind of smile that didn't quite reach his eyes but was filled with a certain warmth that made Eleanor pause. "I don't mind sad," he said with a slight chuckle. "As long as it's real." The way he said that made Eleanor feel something stir inside her, a quiet recognition that had been buried for so long. There was something in his voice that reminded her of her son, Matthew, and the gentle sincerity that came from a place of raw emotion. It wasn't just the words that struck Eleanor, but the weight behind them, the unspoken sadness that seemed to echo in both of their hearts. After that day, Julian came over more often. He returned the book, borrowed others, and even started bringing over small things like a pair of scissors or a jar of honey. Eleanor found herself growing accustomed to his visits. She began to look forward to them, even if she didn't always understand why. There was no grand gesture, no explosion of feelings. It was just small, quiet moments where two people simply sat together, shared a cup of tea, and said very little. Yet in those moments, Eleanor felt something inside her begin to change. She had spent the last decade shielding herself from the world, her heart closed off from the possibility of another connection. But Julian's presence was different. He didn't push, didn't demand anything. He simply existed in the same space, a soft presence in the house that had long been empty. And for the first time in years, Eleanor allowed herself to feel something more than loneliness. She found herself thinking about Julian long after he had left, wondering what he was doing, what he was thinking. His visits, though simple, were becoming the highlight of her days. It was on a particularly warm afternoon that Eleanor found herself standing at the window, watching Julian walk across the yard with a bag of cookies in hand. She had never been one to accept things from others so easily, yet when he handed her the bag, her heart didn't flinch. She smiled softly as she accepted them, and as he turned to leave, she stood there for a long moment, watching him disappear down the path. It was a strange feeling, this quiet longing, this soft connection that had begun to blossom in the most unexpected of places. And so, with each passing day, the house that had once felt like a tomb to her son's memory slowly began to feel a little more alive. Though the locked door to room 5 remained closed, the rest of the house began to hum with a gentle rhythm of a life that was, at last, starting to breathe again. Eleanor had never expected her life to change in such a quiet, gradual way. Days passed, and with each visit, Julian seemed to settle into her life with an ease that was both comforting and foreign. He had moved into the house next door, but it felt as though he was slowly, imperceptibly, becoming part of her world. At first, it was nothing more than the shared moments over tea, small talk about books or weather. But somewhere between the sips of chamomile tea and the soft murmurs of their conversations, something shifted. It was subtle, like the passing of seasons, but it was real. That morning, after Julian had left with a small plate of cookies, Eleanor found herself lingering by the window longer than usual. The late summer sun filtered through the leaves of the garden, casting dappled shadows on the porch. Her eyes followed Julian as he walked back to his house, his hands shoved casually into his pockets, the faintest trace of a smile playing on his lips. It was odd. She thought he had become a regular part of her routine, a part of the rhythm she hadn't realized she was craving. And yet, there was something about him that made her heart flutter in ways she hadn't felt in years. It wasn't love, not in the way that her heart had once ached for Thomas, or even the way she had adored her son Matthew. No, this was different. It was the quiet stirrings of a woman who had long buried her desires, buried her own needs, in the shadow of loss. But Julian's presence, the softness of his eyes, the gentleness of his voice, brought to the surface something Eleanor had nearly forgotten. A feeling of being seen, of being noticed. For the first time in years, Eleanor felt something stir in her chest, a reminder that she was more than just a widow, more than just the woman who had lost everything. But this realization frightened her. She wasn't sure what to do with these feelings. She wasn't sure she even wanted to know. For days, Eleanor tried to shake off the subtle change in her life. She went about her routine, tending to the garden, cleaning the house, making her tea. But each time Julian knocked on her door, each time he appeared in her yard with a book or a small gift, it felt harder to ignore the quiet ache in her heart. She found herself waiting for his visits, anticipating his knock, looking forward to their shared moments. And when he left, there was a small sense of emptiness that she couldn't quite explain. It wasn't that she was lonely, no, she had lived in this house alone for years. It was something else, something deeper, something that made her wonder if she had closed herself off from the world for too long. She wasn't sure she was ready to open herself up again, but Julian's presence had a way of breaking down the walls she had so carefully built. One evening, as she sat in her living room reading an old novel, the silence was broken by the sound of Julian's footsteps on the porch. She glanced up, feeling a flutter in her chest. He had become a fixture in her life in a way she hadn't expected. She smiled softly, setting the book aside, and walked to the door. When she opened it, she was greeted by the familiar sight of him holding a small plate of freshly baked cookies. "I made too many," he said with a smile, his brown eyes twinkling with a kind of warmth that made Eleanor's heart skip a beat. Eleanor took the plate without a word, but the quiet gesture stirred something inside her. It wasn't just the cookies, though they were delicious. It was the unspoken bond between them, the gentle care that seemed to exist in every small action, every quiet conversation. For the first time in a long while, Eleanor didn't feel like she was simply existing. She felt like she was living again. They sat together in the living room, the warmth of the tea filling the space between them. Julian spoke softly about his day, his struggles with his writing, his dreams of someday being a published author. Eleanor listened, her heart heavy with a strange mix of emotions. She had lived through loss, through grief, through years of silence. And yet, sitting across from Julian, she realized that she was beginning to hope again. Hope for something. Though she wasn't sure what it was. As Julian talked, Eleanor found herself watching him more closely than she ever had before. She noticed the way his eyes brightened when he spoke of his passions, how his hands moved as if they were telling their own story. She couldn't help but feel drawn to him, drawn to his energy, to the way he seemed to fill the room with his presence. He wasn't just a neighbor anymore. He was someone who made her feel alive, someone who reminded her that she was more than just a widow living in the past. And yet, despite the growing connection between them, Eleanor remained cautious. She didn't want to allow herself to fall into this unexpected bond. She didn't want to make the same mistakes again. But there was something about Julian's gentleness, his patience, that made it impossible to stay detached. She knew it, and she felt it every time their eyes met across the room, every time their hands brushed against each other, even if by accident. The days passed, and with each one, the connection between them grew stronger. Julian would arrive in the mornings, sometimes with a book, sometimes with a basket of fresh bread. Eleanor would invite him in, and they would sit together in comfortable silence, sharing stories of their pasts, talking about nothing and everything all at once. She began to enjoy these small moments, began to crave them in a way she hadn't thought possible. But Eleanor's mind was still filled with doubts. She had lived with the memory of Matthew's loss for so long that it felt as though nothing could fill the void. Nothing could erase the pain that still lingered in her heart. And yet, with Julian's presence, something had begun to change. She could feel it deep inside her, the shift from a life of mourning to a life of possibility. But the fear still gripped her. Could she truly allow herself to love again? Could she open her heart, knowing the pain that could follow? One evening, as they sat together, the question hung heavy in the air. Eleanor took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly as she poured them both a cup of tea. She didn't want to confront the feelings that were slowly, but surely, growing inside her. She didn't want to admit that she was starting to care for him. But as Julian smiled at her, his eyes warm and sincere, she couldn't help but wonder if this was the moment when everything could change. The days passed like soft whispers in the air, the seasons changing imperceptibly as Eleanor and Julian continued their quiet dance of companionship. Each day felt like the beginning of something new, something fragile, something worth protecting. Their bond, though unspoken, was growing, and it was starting to feel like the world around them had faded into the background. It was as if, for the first time in years, Eleanor could see a life beyond the confines of her grief, a life that just might, hold something more for her. And yet, even as the days slipped by, Eleanor couldn't shake the fear that something was lurking beneath the surface, something that could shatter everything they were building. Eleanor's thoughts were a constant swirl, a mix of fear and hope, guilt and desire. She had opened her heart to Julian in ways she hadn't allowed herself in over a decade. She found herself looking forward to his visits, anticipating the soft cadence of his voice as he spoke about his writing or his dreams. She even began to look forward to the small touches, the casual brush of his hand against hers as they moved through the house together. But the question lingered. Was she fooling herself? Was she just trying to fill the empty space left by her son, her husband? Or was this something real? One afternoon, as the sun dipped low in the sky, Eleanor stood in the garden, her hands resting gently on the railing of the porch. The scent of lavender still lingered in the air, and for the first time in years, the house no longer felt like a mausoleum of memories. It felt like a home. Her heart beat steadily in her chest as she watched Julian approach, carrying a small pot of flowers. His eyes, those deep brown eyes, seemed to reflect something she hadn't seen in a long time: tenderness. "Here," Julian said softly, handing her the pot. "These are for you. I thought they'd look nice in the window." Eleanor took the pot from him, a smile tugging at her lips. "Thank you," she replied, her voice thick with emotion she hadn't anticipated. They stood there for a long moment, neither of them speaking. The air between them was heavy with unspoken words, a weight that neither was ready to lift. Eleanor could feel the pull of Julian's presence, the undeniable connection that had been building between them for months. She felt it in the way he looked at her, the way he listened to her, the way his presence filled the space of her home like sunlight filtering through the windows. And yet, even as her heart softened, there was something else that kept her at arm's length, a truth. She was too afraid to face Dot. As evening settled in, Julian asked if he could stay for dinner. Eleanor agreed, the words slipping out before she could stop them. She didn't want to admit how much she looked forward to these quiet dinners, these simple moments of shared company. They ate in silence, the gentle clinking of silverware the only sound filling the room. The warmth between them felt like a balm, soothing the cracks in Eleanor's heart. She watched Julian eat, the way he chewed thoughtfully, the way he smiled when she mentioned something trivial, and she found herself caught up in the rhythm of it all, the rhythm of being seen, of being acknowledged. But deep inside, Eleanor could feel the truth pressing against her chest. She knew the past had a way of catching up with you, even when you thought you had buried it long ago. And Julian, for all his warmth and gentleness, was still a stranger in some ways. He didn't know what she had lost, what she had buried in the rooms of this house. He didn't know the weight of the memories that clung to her like a second skin. That night, as they sat on the porch, the sky darkening around them, Eleanor's mind wandered. Julian was talking about his writing again, but her thoughts were elsewhere. She was watching him, her gaze lingering on his profile, the way his jaw tensed when he was deep in thought. Her heart ached. She didn't know how to explain it to him, how to explain the pull she felt, the way she was starting to care for him in a way that frightened her. She was scared to admit that she was beginning to love him, not in the way she had loved her late husband, not in the way she had loved her son, but in a way that was uniquely her own. A love that was both tender and terrifying. Eleanor? Julian's voice broke through her thoughts, and she looked up to meet his gaze. She replied softly, her heart racing as their eyes met. I'm sorry if I've made you feel uncomfortable, he said, his voice low. I don't want to rush anything or push you into something you're not ready for. Eleanor was taken aback by his words. He had always been patient, always careful with her. But hearing him speak so gently, so understandingly, made her realize just how much she had come to depend on his presence. You haven't, she replied, her voice trembling slightly. It's just ... I don't know what this is between us. It's complicated. Julian nodded, his expression thoughtful. I understand, he said quietly. But whatever it is, we'll figure it out together. I don't want to be just a memory for you, Eleanor. I want to be someone you can count on. Eleanor felt a lump form in her throat, her chest tightening at his words. She wanted to tell him that she wasn't sure she was ready to let go of the past, that she wasn't sure she was ready to embrace a future that involved him. But something inside her whispered that maybe she could allow herself to love again, even if it meant facing the ghosts of the past. The next few days were filled with a quiet tension, a sense that something was shifting between them. Julian's visits grew more frequent, and with each one, Eleanor found herself drawing closer to him even as she tried to keep her distance. It was as if she were standing at the edge of a precipice, unsure whether to take the leap or to retreat into the safety of her memories. Then, one evening, as they sat together in the living room, Julian's gaze turned serious. He had been quieter than usual, his eyes darker, as if he were wrestling with something. Eleanor noticed the change immediately, the subtle shift in his demeanor. Eleanor, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. There's something I need to tell you. Eleanor's heart skipped a beat. She felt a sudden rush of fear of the unknown, fear of what he might say. What is it? She asked, her voice barely audible. I need to be honest with you, Julian continued, his words slow and deliberate. I haven't been completely truthful with you. There's something about my past that you don't know. Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face. A cold, unsettling feeling washed over her. She knew what was coming. She had known, deep down, that this moment would come. The past always had a way of catching up with you. You don't have to tell me if it's too much, she said, her voice trembling. But she could hear the hesitation in his words, the weight of whatever truth he was about to reveal. Julian took a deep breath, his gaze never leaving hers. "It's about the accident," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "I was the one who caused it, the one that killed your son." The words hit Eleanor like a physical blow. She recoiled as if she had been struck, her breath catching in her throat. The room seemed to close in around her, the walls pressing against her chest. She had heard those words before, the words that had shattered her life, the words that had turned her world upside down. But hearing them now, coming from Julian's lips, felt like a betrayal she wasn't sure she could ever forgive. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was deafening, filled with the weight of years of grief and pain. Eleanor's mind raced, her thoughts spiraling as she tried to process what he had just said. Julian, the man she had come to care for, the man who had brought light back into her life, was the one who had taken her son away from her. Tears filled Eleanor's eyes as she stood up abruptly, her hands trembling. "I don't know what to say," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I can't believe this. How could you not tell me?" Julian stood too, his face filled with remorse and guilt. "I didn't know who you were when it happened," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I didn't know it was your son. I've lived with that guilt every day, and I didn't know how to tell you." Eleanor's heart felt like it was being torn in two. The man she had allowed herself to care for had been the one responsible for the greatest loss of her life. She could feel her chest tightening, the weight of the truth suffocating her. But somewhere beneath the pain, there was a flicker of something else, a sense that this wasn't the end. It couldn't be. "I need some time," Eleanor said quietly, her voice raw. "I don't know what to do with this. I need time to think." Julian nodded, his eyes filled with regret. He didn't speak again. He just stood there, watching her, his heart breaking as he saw the woman he had come to love retreat into herself, the walls rising between them once again.